Hi there, my name is Cole Bowden, I'm a developer advocate here at Firebolt, and welcome back to FireEdge. In this video, we're going to be talking about compute families, and how to select which compute family is right for you. So I'll start by just explaining the concept of a compute family. In Firebolt, when you start up an engine, the nodes in your engine are actually AWS EC2 instances. AWS EC2 has a lot of different possible hardware configurations. They can vary based on processor manufacturer, generation of processor, amount of different resources in proportion to each other, and there's a lot of flexibility in terms of which instance you want to grab from them. Now, in Firebolt, we've always taken the storage-optimized compute family from AWS EC2. And what this means is that relative to other specifications and hardware, it has had relatively more disk space. So you have CPUs, you have RAM or memory, and you have SSD. And a storage-optimized instance from EC2 may have a really large SSD and then comparably less RAM and CPU. Now, you can increase the size of your EC2 instance such that you have more RAM than a memory-optimized instance, but it's going to cost more because you're paying for more hardware overall. Now, this also makes sense as a default in Firebolt, and we still recommend it for most of our users. Having a large SSD means that you are able to cache more data in your Firebolt engine and avoid reading it over network. So a larger cache means more cache data, means less network reads, means faster queries. It's a good default, and it's why it's where we started. Now, we're introducing a new compute family in Firebolt, and it's because storage optimized as a compute family isn't quite one size fits all. There's a couple reasons for this, but the simplest is that sometimes you don't need all of that disk space to cache the data you care about. Whether that's because you have a small data set or you only care about a subset of a larger data set. This SSD, even on a small Firebolt node, is on the scale of terabytes, and sometimes that's just too much, and you're unable to saturate it, and you're spending money on disk space that you're unable to leverage or utilize. Rather than do that, why not have a different compute family where you can put your money to better use on resources you can use? And that's why we're introducing the compute-optimized compute family. Now, you might gather from the name that it's going to provide you with more compute power, and that is entirely correct. You're going to have CPU proportionally higher than RAM and SSD. And this is good when you have small data sets, or you want to do workloads that are more CPU intensive relative to memory or disk intensive. Now, one other thing to note is that because of the specific instances we've chosen from EC2, the RAM on the storage optimized instance is actually proportionally higher than it is on a compute optimized instance. So in Firebolt, these two graphs may look a little more like this, and that's not necessarily true for every storage optimized and compute optimized instance type that comes from EC2. Now, the other thing to note about these two different compute families is that the compute optimized compute family comes with relatively less hardware overall, and that means that it also costs half the price of the same engine size in a storage optimized compute family. Now, the way this works is that we've controlled for CPU capacity as the consistent thing across different node sizes. So a small storage optimized node and a small compute optimized node actually have the same compute power, and then the compute optimized node will have less memory and less disk. That's why it costs half as much, and that's why it works better on smaller data sets. All right, I'd now like to show you how this works in the Firebolt product. The first thing to show off is how you can swap compute families. While you can do this with SQL, you can also use it in the UI, where you click Modify Engine, click on Advanced Settings, and then change your selection in this dropdown for compute family here. I have a storage optimized engine, and I can change it to compute optimized, and then click Modify Engine to change the compute family of my engine. Now, another thing to note is that when I made this change, my consumption per hour went down from 8 FBUs to 4 FBUs, and if I change back to storage optimized, it'll bump back up to 8 FBUs. This is of course because my engine size stayed constant when I made this change, and as stated previously, when I go from storage optimized to compute optimized, my consumption and cost get cut in half. The next thing I'd like to show you is how queries run on these two different engines. Now, I have a query here that's relatively computationally complex. I'm using a 1 terabyte web traffic dataset where I'm selecting the 30 busiest days in that dataset and then getting some more information about them. Because we need to understand the busiest days in the entire dataset, it's going to take a little bit of time and require some processing power. So when I kick this query off, you can see that we begin scanning data, and if I go to the Engine Monitoring tab, you'll see that CPU use is what jumps up immediately. Memory and disk stay relatively low. And that's a good sign that this query would run well on a compute-optimized engine. It's because the disk and RAM limitations of the compute-optimized engine will not be a bottleneck here, and should serve well for reducing cost with the same performance. You can see that on a storage-optimized engine, this query took 6.03 seconds to return our results. Now, I'll run the same query on a compute-optimized engine, and you'll see when we start scanning data and I go check the engine monitoring tab, our CPU utilization once again begins jumping up. We're using proportionally more memory because we have less memory, but you can see we completed the query in 6.05 seconds, nearly identical to the 6.03 seconds of the storage optimized engine. So at half the cost, we got exactly the same performance. That's the power of a compute optimized engine. Now, of course, it's important to note that I picked this example because I knew it would be a good showcase of a compute-optimized engine in Firebolt. If you're looking to use one, you should run your own queries and check that engine monitoring tab to see what resources you're leveraging. If RAM and SSD utilization are low, that's a good sign you can use a compute-optimized engine. If they aren't low, that's a good sign that you should stay with storage optimized. To learn more about compute families in Firebolt, check out the tech blog I wrote, linked in the description. For more information on selecting the correct compute family for your Firebolt workload, there's also a knowledge base article linked in the description. Thanks for watching.